Welcome to EdTech Speaks, a podcast bringing guests together to share their expertise and advice on navigating business and education in a technology-driven world. From entrepreneurs to vendors, higher education to corporate leaders, we'll uncover their perspective regarding the latest trends and technologies impacting your career or business. Our podcast is made possible by Downing EdTech Consulting, where people and technology connect. Hosted by Cher Downing, an experienced executive spanning a higher education and corporate career with specific focus on the EdTech industry. Dr. Downing is also an international and national presenter, author, and regular media contributor. Now here is your host, EdTech strategist, Dr. Cher Downing.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to EdTech Speaks, a podcast where we bring guests to share their expertise and advice on navigating business and education in a technology-driven world. Our goal is to provide you with options for products, services, and knowledge that can help benefit you or your business. I'm Cher Downing, your host, and I want to introduce today's guest, Dr. Thomas Tobin, a speaker and consultant in higher education, author of The Copyright Ninja, and a couple of other new books that I'm going to let him discuss a little further. Welcome, Tom. How are you today?
Hi, Cher. It's good to be with you here. I'm doing okay, and I'm grateful to be talking with you and your listeners.
Excellent. Well, I'm very excited for our listeners to hear more about what you do, because I think you are in a very unique space, which really kind of takes the mystery out of higher ed in the sense of being just about academia and just about traditional learning. So to begin with, I'd love it if you could introduce a little bit about yourself and let our listeners know who you are and what you're doing.
Well, thank you. And my history is, like many of your listeners, not a straight line from school to work to where I am today. And I used to joke around with my partner that I never wanted to be a big fish in a small pond. I always wanted to be a big fish in the wrong pond. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. So I was working as a new person in the field. I wanted to be a college professor. I wanted to be a teacher in the classroom. And I was working on my PhD in English literature. I specialized in 19th century literature and art history. So if you want to talk about Dante Gabriel Rossetti and John Everett Millay, I'm your guy. Along the way, though, I started getting into scholarly bibliography back in the early 1990s, when the internet was first starting to become a thing. I got into database management because I needed those skills in order to do a bibliography for my dissertation work. It turned out that the technical skills that I was teaching myself, how to code HTML, doing JavaScript and CSS language stuff, those were the things that actually got me my first academic jobs before I even earned my PhD. I started out at a 2-year college in Pennsylvania back in 1998 and 99. They hired me to help them create online courses. Now, this is back in the day, I helped them adopt Blackboard version 1. So that's how long ago this was. And at the same time, I started working with colleagues and students who had all kinds of barriers to their education. So we served students who were in a rural environment. We served students who lived more than 15 or 20 miles away from our campus. We served students who were primarily working adults who had families and jobs and military commitments. And we served a lot of students who had physical disabilities or learning disabilities as well. I also worked with a colleague, his name was Marty, and he taught business courses. He said, I think that this online is the wave of the future. I don't think it's really good at all. I don't think it's useful or as effective as face-to-face teaching, but the world is moving this way, and so I'm going to do it. So, not the most honorable of intentions or noble kind of a story. But Marty's story was different because Marty had gone blind in his 40s due to undiagnosed and so untreated diabetes. He didn't know, and I'll put air quotes here, how to be a blind person. Sure. He didn't use a cane. He didn't know Braille. He couldn't even touch type. So he was a formerly sighted person who suddenly found himself really challenged. And he came to me and said, help me teach online. And so I said, yeah, sure, I'll help you. I'll go back and look at the literature, and the literature will save me. There was no literature. I was very fortunate. I got connected with Norm Coombs at Rochester Institute of Technology. He was an advocate for instructors and faculty members with disability barriers. He was blind since birth. And his advice to me was essentially good luck, kid. But helping Marty, now we actually did get him to teach online. It was great. We got graduate students from a local university, and they became his eyes and ears. So when students would send things in through the Blackboard learning management system, these graduate students would be in the room with Marty, and they would read what the students had said, or they would read students' papers out loud. This is before artificial intelligence got really good.
Sure.
And Marty was able to teach his course for 3 semesters before we realized that we were violating privacy laws 7 different ways, and we had to stop. So that's a long story about how I got started, but it contains the seeds of everything I've done since. I'm a trained academician. I know a little bit about technology, maybe a little more than a little bit. And I found an audience of people whom we weren't serving well, and in some cases, not serving at all. So you mentioned my comic book, The Copyright Ninja. My other books are all in these areas of study, and they arose from problems that I perceived I was having and other people were having. So evaluating online teaching, I wrote that with Annie Taylor from Penn State and Gene Mandernack from Grand Canyon University. We figured out that there were tons of books on how to assess the design of online courses, but there wasn't really guidance about how to observe online teaching in a way that was unique to online. And then how do you take a department chair or an administrator who's never taught with technology before, and back in 2015, that was most of us, and have that person give you, Cher Downing, technology forward instructor, a meaningful and legally binding observation of your skills. And what we discovered was that in the United States and Canada, and this is still true, online courses are observed at a rate almost 1/10 of face-to-face instruction. And now that lots of us have had to switch to remote instruction, that book is starting to get a lot more play. The other books that I've got out there, Reach Everyone, Teach Everyone, Universal Design for Learning in Higher Education. I wrote that with Kirsten Bailing, who is at Tufts University. She's in the disability services vertical, and I'm on the ed tech side of the house. And we took universal design for learning, giving people multiple ways of staying engaged, multiple ways of getting information, and multiple ways of showing what they know. And we reframed that for mobile learners, people on their mobile devices, and people in higher education. And then the last one that just came out at the beginning of this year is called Going Alt-Ac. And I wrote this with Katie Linder and Kevin Kelly. And that is us talking about how we didn't go through the traditional get your PhD, be recommended into a tenure track position, and become a professor line of things. In fact, that's how most of us end up in technology mediated or tech adjacent positions in and near higher education. I spent 7 years of my work working in the learning and design arm of Blue Cross and Blue Shield. And then I came back into higher education. So a lot of us have taken those paths where we've gotten skills in lots of different areas. And that's one of the reasons why I love to work with folks who aren't necessarily going to be the people who get the one tenure line position out of the 2,000 people who've applied for it, because it's most of us. And I want to talk to the people who are actually doing the work that supports education, learning, and development across various industries. So that's the maybe 4-minute version of where I come from.
And to those of you that are listening, this is proof from yet another one of our guests that linear and vertical and horizontal are not the only 3 directives that live in the world, if you're smart about it. One of the things we always talk about is every person that we bring in, there's a key factor of all of us, which is we never say no to an opportunity. Doesn't mean it's a great opportunity. Oftentimes it's a horrible problem or something everyone has washed their hands of, walked away from, not thought of. The people that have been resilient in the ed tech space, because we've existed longer than the industry has in reality, is because we were open to that challenge. We were open to trying it. We figured, what's the worst that could happen? We can't be any worse off than we are at this moment.
Well, isn't that the truth, though? And I'm, I guess, by temperament, the kind of person who, when everybody is running away from a problem or something, I'm running toward it.
Yep.
But even if you're not that kind of person, one of the advantages that we have in the ed tech field is we've collectively come up with problems and solutions that the rest of the world around us is just now coming to understand. So, a good example of that is the COVID-19 pandemic. So,
Yes.
with the virus shutting things down, now colleges and universities are either trying to make the best go of face to face education, or they've shut everything down and gone completely remote on purpose. But either way, colleges and universities are now having to decide which way are we going to go. And it's not just the people who choose that particular set of technologies or those particular affordances. Everybody has to be ready to do what they're calling the toggle, right? So we might have to go online for a couple of weeks and then come back to face to face. So how do we design the interactions that we're going to have with our learners, not just interactions in the classroom, but also for support services, our librarians, our financial aid folks, our tutoring folks, our mental health counselors, all of those interactions? How do we do that at a distance? How do we do that where our students don't all have reliable internet, don't all have a laptop or a desktop computer? So a lot of those questions are things that some of us we addressed back in the late 1990s. So there's a lot of us who've got deep experience in the field who are saying, oh yeah, it's 1998 all over again, isn't it? Except this time, it's not just the people who chose to be part of technology mediation. It's everybody who's sort of been dragged along into it, whether they wanted to or not. And that's been one of the things that's kept me both busy and happily satisfied with the work that I'm doing, because now I'm talking to the people who maybe 10 years ago would tell me, I don't have to pay attention to that stuff.
Absolutely.
I'm safe in what I do. And it turns out that having that technology background was really kind of a superpower that many people didn't appreciate yet. And a lot of your listeners will know that if you want to have job security, one of the things you can look for is anybody who wants an instructional designer, an ed tech person. These days, you can kind of write your own ticket because people are desperate for someone who knows the technology and who can also talk about it in plain language that other people will understand.
That is so true. I've seen a lot of freelancers who have been picking up short-term jobs. They're now turning into full-time jobs because once they're in the company and once they're working for them or the institution, suddenly somebody goes, wow, this person is really good and we're getting things done and we're no longer feeling frightened by all of this that's occurred. One of the things that you talked about, and I love this because you and I have had about the same trajectory time-wise, is 28 years ago, we had barriers to education, exactly the ones that you mentioned, disabilities, remoteness, students just having learning issues. So we've come forward 28 years and we're still having these same conversations around the table. We've upped our game, so to speak, in terms of artificial intelligence, and we've got more things out there that will do things on our behalf. But we still haven't closed in that gap between AI really being responsive learning as opposed to running off of fed material to deliver learning. Where do you see us going with that?
It's an interesting future because you talk about having not made a lot of terrible progress because the challenges are still there. And I would frame it just slightly differently. I would say that the challenges are still there, and we haven't gotten rid of those challenges of distance, time, ability, access. But we have chipped away at them like crazy, right? So if you think back to the late 1990s, the early 2000s, only about 43% of people in the United States, looking back at the Pearson and Pew research here, only about 43% of people in the United States and Canada owned a smartphone. Nowadays, we're upwards of 87% when we look at the general population. And then when we look at people who are enrolled in colleges and universities, it's upwards of 94% of people own a smartphone. At the same time, when we're looking at that college and university population of learners, it's only about 60% who own any other internet-connected device. That's laptops, tablets, desktop computers, you name it. And when we're talking about the traditional workhorses, the laptops and desktops, that's down around 30% now. And it's actually declining. Why is that so? Because our phones do more for us today. So if we can think about there's two different gaps that you mentioned. One of them is the instruction gap. So if I'm an instructor in a college course or if I'm a teacher in K-12, is artificial intelligence going to get good enough that it can have conversations with learners and know what the learners will need next, be able to assess, evaluate, and then plan for learners? And artificial intelligence is getting pretty good at that. At the same time, we're not to the point where we would just like to turn Siri on and let Siri teach our sixth graders. The challenge for artificial intelligence is that it is good with context in general, and it really stinks in terms of context in the individual, so that there is still a place for human intelligence. There's still a place for assessment and evaluation and feedback. One of the things that I love to see, and this is a trend that's already starting, is many people in K-12, industry, and higher education are moving away from numerical grades.
Yes.
I am an advocate for ungrading, which is taking the numerical part out. So if you take two students and they've both written essays and you sit them down next to one another and say, you got an 83%, you got an 84%, and you ask them to tell you where that 1% difference is, they couldn't tell you, and you probably couldn't either.
That's a great example.
So when we're thinking about giving people feedback in technology-mediated ways, that actually allows us to give people feedback via text, via audio, like we're doing here today, via video. There's lots of different ways that we can get information across. That's part of universal design for learning, another thing of which I'm an advocate, and that is giving people more than one way that they can take control, have choices, get information from you, and share information back to you as a demonstration of skill. So that's one gap that we can talk about that I would reframe a little bit. The other frame here is that in terms of future with technology, we've already passed the point where technology use is a must versus a nice to have. And I'll tell you what I mean. Even in the lower grades where we're talking about K through 6, one of the biggest challenges, there was just a recent article in the New Yorker about the Baltimore public schools and how many of the children who are in those public schools, they don't have stable home environments. Their parents don't have a laptop computer. They have to download apps onto their phones. And it's kind of a mess because you need somebody who is responsible to download all the stuff and keep track of the technology in order for young children to be able to learn. In a way that when I worked with my higher education folks, it's the students themselves who are supposed to be responsible to get the links and sign into the sessions and use the technology as a mediating factor.
Sure.
So when we're talking about nice to have versus must have, when we're in pandemic remote instruction, if all of that instruction takes place live, then you have to be there or you're not there. One of the big shifts that I see coming is we're going to move away from what we might call Zoom University and Zoom School, where everybody has to be online at the same time. In fact, we made this shift back in 1997 as well. 1997, it was eventually we're going to have enough bandwidth where we can do video, right? But there was a lot of live audio connection back in the day. And we figured out that that was a little bit discriminatory because it meant that you had to be there at that time. And so we're going to see the rise of a lot more asynchronous instruction. We're going to see a lot more learning and development and training in business and industry being on your own time and then having access to an expert who you can interact with on your own time as you learn, as you scaffold and pace your way through in a self-paced way. You'll also see a lot of cohorted asynchronous learning start to rise up in response to Zoom School and Zoom University, where everybody's moving through the same material together and it's take a message, leave a message. There'd be a lot more discussion forums, blogs, those kinds of more static kinds of things where you do the work on your own time. And then if there is a live together kind of interaction, that's where you flip the classroom. That's where the live event becomes ask the instructor about anything or share your problems or let's work through things together rather than getting new information in those live events.
So one of the things I've noticed recently is with several of the virtual conferences and summits, naturally everyone's had to move everything over. Something that they didn't used to do as a natural practice, a few did, but not often, was say, go ahead and register. And if you can't make it, maybe you said tomorrow at noon and now you have a meeting, we'll send you the recording. We didn't used to do that. We really wanted you to be there. We really wanted you to be in the audience. Now, we didn't ask you to do anything and we didn't show you. We didn't give you any live access, but we wanted you there. Now I'm seeing where they're saying, hey, you can just get the recording and then here's a space to ask questions. So it's exactly what you're talking about, which is there's really not a need for us to be all in the same place and all at the same time. We had a recent example in the state of Arizona. In the best of intentions, one of the school districts bought iPads for all of the kids to take home. This was back in March. We're going to be home for 2 more months. Everybody gets an iPad, they're going to learn. What they didn't think about was that it's a low-income area, and over 85% of those people didn't have internet access. So immediately, a couple of the corporations stepped in, said in the short term, they can come to our parking lot, we'll give them password, they set up a space for them, and then in the long term, we'll set up Wi-Fi areas for them in those neighborhoods. We're not there yet in terms of everything being in place, and you're exactly right. We kind of get overzealous in some respects because we want to do things and we realize that they're not all there. The other example you gave was talking about like using Siri. What brought it to mind was when Justice Ginsburg passed away last week, Siri had a message on there. So you could say, Siri, how do you feel about her passing? Or did you know she passed? Or whatever question you wanted to ask Siri. And Siri gave you what is somewhat of a heartfelt response. So it had human emotion. It was, I feel kind of sad today. And she went on and on and on. But obviously, that's not Siri. That's somebody's voice that's typed it in, because the emotional intelligence piece isn't attached to the artificial intelligence piece yet. We're not there. We're doing better and we can do more things with it. But it's fascinating how all of these things are being driven really almost simultaneously because of COVID. And we're making faster progression now than we have in the last 25 years as a result of it, not because we weren't interested before, but we didn't have an understanding of why it was important. And suddenly this year, we figured it out.
Yeah, and you put your finger on something important in what you said about conferences just now. You said that for face-to-face conferences, we asked you to be there and we didn't really ask you to do anything. We just put your butt in a seat and this is professional development. And that's what a lot of conferences end up being. And it's mostly because folks who get their papers accepted to present at conferences, they've seen other people stand up at a lectern and read their papers, and they think that's what professional development is. And it's the same problem that we have in education, but small. I work with the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and we put on the Distance Teaching and Learning Conference every year. And we've gone to a virtual format for it, and we have the same problem. That problem is, even when we were a face-to-face in-person event, we didn't want people just to be butts in seats. We wanted them to interact. We wanted them to be part of the conversation. When they would see a presentation, we wanted to make sure that there was plenty of time for Q&A, for engaging with the audience and the presenters, for having hallway conversations, for sitting down and connecting with new folks. That kind of collaboration is what makes a school classroom work, and that's the kind of collaboration that makes professional development work well also. Now that our conferences are going online, I just had an email conversation with a colleague yesterday, and he said, now that you've gone completely online, it's harder for me to convince my boss that I should take time away from work to focus only on the professional development of the conference. And that is the big key to your own professional development, listeners. It's making the time and blocking it off and getting your colleagues and bosses' consent and help to make sure that you don't have to try to multitask, which we of course can't do, that you can focus your attention on those learning areas and times for the conference. In fact, I just wrote a piece in the Chronicle of Higher Education on how to get the most out of virtual conferences. That's advice number one. So as event planners, what we're trying to do is we're trying to A, give you an excuse to pay attention only to this thing, and B, to make sure that it's not a presentation, that it's more of a conversation, that there's more give and take, that there are purposeful points where the presenters stop and say, now, how would you use this? How can you apply this? Let's talk. Let's do a thought exercise. Let's do something interactive. And with the virtual format, technology is an affordance for us because it allows people to have robust side conversations in the chat during a Zoom session. It allows people to go and look at resources online together and play around. And you can open up a shared Google document and have everybody in your session actually interacting and building something together. I was just in a webinar with Tori Mondelli from the University of Missouri, and part of her portion of the presentation was she had a virtual crossword puzzle that she asked everybody to start trying out. And it was a wonderful collaborative effort on her topic. And it was a really good example of how we can use interaction as the key overarching theme for all the things we do with educational technology. If it doesn't let me interact, why am I doing it? If it's just watching TV by other means, we've probably failed. So
Yep.
So I love that you're talking about how we do those interactions. And then with your comment about AI being just programmed, that's one of the few things that we have as human beings using technology rather than technology as we've programmed it, that is kind of the holy grail for artificial intelligence programmers, which is to make an AI that emotes, that picks up on nuance and emotional tone and those kinds of things. For now, that's entirely the province of human beings. And I think it's something that sets us apart. And when we are having conversations with people who aren't in ed tech, one of the biggest things we can do to open doors for them is to come at the technology and use technology in a way that facilitates interaction and emotional learning.
Exactly. And it's interesting because, when you talk about doing the crossword puzzle, one of the things that all of us in education, doesn't matter if you're K through 12, higher ed, even corporate trainers, it's always about assessment. It's always about knowledge check.
Yep.
So you're doing fun things in there in an interactive way. And guess what? You now have data of seeing what people have done. If you look in the chat room and you see conversations and you can say, wow, somebody's so confused about that point I just made. Let me go back and work through that. Or, wow, people really would love to hear more about this part of my segment. When I give this talk again, I might shift it just a little bit. So there's a real opportunity when you're delivering to also be getting something back from it. To your point about virtual conferences, I talked with someone the other day who their company normally sends about a dozen people to a conference. And this year, the conference has moved virtual. So they are letting everyone stay home remotely because they've all just now returned to their offices. But their thought is you would have been gone the whole week to the conference. So be gone the whole week to the conference. Now, they're going to get together and put together a presentation to give to fellow staff members and such when they return to say, hey, here's some of the things that were covered in the conference. But they said, we would have had them do that anyway. That's how we justify when we pay for 12 people to travel. So they're allowing them to do this instead and saying, no, because if you're in the office, we'll disrupt you and you'll never get to attend anything. So they've thought through the process. So for our listeners, if any of you are managing teams, working with people that you normally send out, this is now becoming fall conference season, figure out ways that you can let them go or put them in a conference room, someplace different on site that they can really enjoy and participate and understand and not be watching the clock or coming in late and leaving early on a session and missing some of the key richness that more than ever is available this year. I have been telling people ASU GSB Summit, which is now in its 11th year, which in 11 years has gone up a little bit in price because it has some pretty expensive names attached to it, but a wealth of information is free. Started today officially. And the odds of getting in on something like that, the odds of sitting in on some of the, even if you were there physically, getting into some of those sessions would be really, really difficult because of the massive amount of people that attend it normally. All of a sudden now you have options.
And the world is shrinking. You talk about you've got big names attached to things. For face-to-face conferences and professional development, it used to be that we had to be careful because we didn't want to necessarily blow our conference budget on international airfare for too many people to come in and be keynote speakers. And now I'm working with our colleagues Sean Bain and Peter Evans at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. They are the editors of a new book called The Manifesto for Teaching Online. It's like my Bible right now. And they're wonderful colleagues. I'm working now with colleagues in Morocco, in South Africa, in Australia, in Ireland. The fact that we no longer expect that we have to stay in our geographic silos is a wonderful thing. Now, I do miss going to Las Vegas and having free shrimp on a buffet, just like everybody else does. But that actually leads to maybe, I think, if you take away nothing else from our episode today, listeners, take away this. And that is all of the skills that you have already put together will serve you as a good foundation for what is coming next. At the same time, don't be afraid to be a beginner. Don't be afraid to not know about things like technology-mediated education, things like universal design for learning. This is the kind of stuff that when you hear about it, you think, ooh, I should have learned that in grad school. Shouldn't have? That should have been, right? Nobody learned that in graduate school. Most of us have come to hard-won knowledge in the field because for myself, my story, like you heard right at the top of our conversation, it was happenstance. I happened to be in a place where I worked with people who had these kinds of challenges, and I saw that it was a more widespread challenge, and I decided to do something about it. But at the same time, what I do right now with my keynoting and speaking and consulting is I'm really giving people permission not to know. I give them permission not to be experts in anything other than their field. And now when things are shifting on them, it's okay to start small, take a few steps, prove to yourself that it's worth doing, and then build on that. So in terms of where my career is right now, it's really rewarding for me because I was an evangelist for a lot of different things that lower barriers for students. And now everybody has those challenges. So now the message that I've been talking about for years and years and years, there are more receptive ears out there. And that's really personally satisfying for me.
Exactly. And I think listeners, the other thing to think about is really assess where you're at all times. Look at what you need to learn. Again, we dislike the issues of COVID, but there's been some good things that have come out of it. One of them is I've seen a real increase in instructional designers volunteering, reaching out, saying, I would love to learn Storyline. I would love to learn how to use Rise, but my company doesn't have it, or I'm not working at a place that, right now. I would do a free project for someone if they would let me play around with it. We're seeing more and more people recognizing that they need a skill set, but also they're helping out someone. I connected a small business with an ID a while back, and the small business was out of cash basically because of everything that's occurred, and really wanted a website and a small commercial put together. This person said, well, what are you using? Because I really need to learn these couple of softwares that are up in the industry. And suddenly they came together and it was a marriage made in heaven. Each got what they wanted out of it and each moved forward with it. So continuously look at your skill set, think about what you can do, ask people like Tom. And there are many of us out there. We all came up in the ranks where companies were coming to us and saying, we have 1.2. Would you like to try it? I was like you. We were an initial pilot for Blackboard. We were initial pilot for WebCT, Ombinet. All of those guys were outreaching, trying to find someone to start and use their products and give them feedback. There's still that today. It's changed a little bit in that maybe it's an app or maybe it's a web-based design and it's not enterprise software. But there's still always people looking, and you never know what that opportunity is going to do for you.
And the truth of it is that, listeners, if you didn't recognize some of those terms from the ancient history of technology that we were just talking about, that's because Dr. Dowling and we go way back. All the gray hair on my head, I've earned all of that. At the same time, the flip side of that coin is also true. I really love to hear from people who are newer in the field, who have skills and ideas that I didn't and couldn't get. And I love to hear your stories, and I will make 20 minutes for anybody. Send me an email message. I'd love to hear your story, see how I can celebrate the work that you do, help you to make connections. And that's probably the biggest advice that I give everybody is that look at the people in fields where you want to go work, get promoted, shift your thinking or your work, and ask them for 20 minutes of their time. If you have a concrete thing to ask about, hey, I'd like to know how you got to where you are. Hey, I know you work with this particular software, or what's it like to work in this particular company or at this college or university? They will help you. Most people are pretty flattered when folks come to them and say, you have expertise. Can I pick your brain? So It's that the conversation with the folks who are well established and the folks who are up and coming, that's what keeps fields moving forward. And I can't tell you how many people I've recommended to speak at conferences or get published or get a job just because we had a 20-minute conversation over coffee and a quick conversation just to share stories. So that's one thing that I can offer to all of your listeners is get in touch with me, and I'd love to hear your story.
And Tom, that leads right into what's the best place to locate you?
You can get all of my contact information. My website is just my name. It's thomasjtobin.com. And from there, you can connect with me on Twitter. And I've got Facebook, LinkedIn, lots of other social media channels and those kinds of things. But that is the one place to start looking for stuff like my email address, a speaking brochure if you wanted to work more with me in a more formal way. And it also is a way to link to lots of the resources that I can help you with as well.
And listeners, I really, really encourage you to take a look at that website. It's constantly being updated. If you haven't guessed it, Dr. Tobin is very passionate about the things that he does. And he made a note here that he gave up caffeine and sugar a couple of years ago. So that's just increased his energy level, which was hard to believe it could increase.
I was going to say, yeah, if you can believe... If you can believe, this is the calmer, quieter version of me. So, yeah, I joke around with folks I'm working with that I'm one half sheepdog and one half hummingbird, and we're in good hands.
That is a perfect description for you. As you said that, it really is. But it's that passion and that excitement and that energy that you really need to take advantage of. As always, we'll give his website on location, so you can look at that. Tom, we really want to thank you for joining us today. This has been so exciting, and I've been looking forward to having you on here because you have managed, as I have, to carve a niche out in the world, somehow by accident and somehow by drive, but it's an opportunity for everyone. I want to thank our listeners for joining us today. And again, I encourage you to reach out to Dr. Tobin and take a look around. We certainly hope you enjoyed this episode at EdTech Speaks and can make use of it. And we look forward to having you joining us again. Find out more information for us at www.downingedtech.com. And until next time, keep learning.
Thank you for listening to EdTech Speaks with EdTech strategist Cher Downing. To learn more about the services Downing EdTech and its staff can provide you, find us at www.downingedtech.com. If you enjoyed today's podcast, be sure to share it. We'd also like to hear from you regarding any suggestions for topics or guests and the value you received from our show. Check back for new podcasts with featured guests at www.downingedtech.com/podcast.